Okay, today we're going to talk about the distance formula. So, distance formula is given to you here. I'm going to outline it in a purple box here. So, little d just stands for distance. Distance equals the square root. And then under your square root, in the first parentheses, you have x2 minus x1, quantity squared, so power of 2. Plus, in your second parentheses, you have y2 minus y1, and then quantity squared, or power of 2. Okay, distance formula is set up because diagonal lines, you just can't count the spaces. Horizontal lines and vertical lines, you could just count the boxes between the two dots. But it does not work that way for the diagonal line. Okay, so that's why they came up with the distance formula. And you can kind of relate some of the distance formula to slope, because you remember in slope we said it was y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So that's when we were doing the change in y over the change in x. Well, those two things just happen to make up the two parentheses inside the square root. You just have to remember to square each number. So let's go give the formula a whirl. So on example number 1, remember, in an ordered pair, x is first, y is second. So this would be x1, y1, x2, y2. So then when we set up the formula, little d equals square root x2. So that would be 4 minus x1, which is 5, quantity squared, plus y2, which is 1, minus y1, which is 2, quantity squared. Okay, let's work on each parentheses. So 4 minus 5 is negative 1 squared, plus the next parentheses, 1 minus 2 is also negative 1 squared. Now, when you put negative 1 squared in your calculator, make sure you're putting parentheses around the negative 1 and put the power of 2 outside the parentheses. So negative 1 squared is positive 1. So you would have 1 plus 1, which would give me the square root of 2. And now finally hit your square root button, and the square root of 2 would be a decimal that I'm going to round to the tenths at 1.4. Okay, next one. So remember, x1, y1, x2, y2. So distance equals, subtract your x's. So that would be negative 4 minus negative 3, quantity squared, plus subtract your y's, which would be 6 minus negative 5, quantity squared. Well, what happens with minus a negative? Well, minus a negative will switch into a plus. So you're looking at negative 4 plus 3, quantity squared, plus 6 plus 5, quantity squared. So remember, minus a negative turns to positive. Negative 4 plus 3 is negative 1 squared. 6 plus 5 is 11 squared. Negative 1 squared is 1. 11 squared is 121. 1 plus 121 is 122. So now take the square root of 122. And if I take the square root of 122, it rounds to the tenths to be 11.0. Okay, pause the video and you try the third one. Hint, hint. Make sure you write the ordered pair for the starting dot and the ending dot, and then do the formula. So then you should be coming up with the square root of 50, and the square root of 50 rounded to the tenths is 7.1. Okay, moving on. Okay, example number 2. It says, you must go to the museum and then to the hospital after school. And I want to know, how far will you travel all together? So remember, I'm starting at the school and I'm going to the museum. And then from the museum, I'm going to the hospital. So let's start with first school to the museum. So if I look at my picture, I can draw the line in from school to the museum, and that's a diagonal line. So if it's a diagonal line, then we have to do the distance formula. So let's start with the ordered pair for school. School, so I'll just use S for school. And that would be the ordered pair 5.5, comma 4.5. And then museum would be 9, comma 2. So distance formula, subtract the x's. So 9 minus 5.5 squared, plus subtract the y's. So 2 minus 4.5 squared. So then I get 3.5 squared plus negative 2.5 squared. 3.5 squared is 12.25. And negative 2.5 squared is positive 6.25. So if I add those together, I get the square root of 18.5. And then the square root of 18.5 rounds to 4.3. Now remember, that's not my total distance. That's just my distance from school to the museum. Now I want to go from the museum to the hospital. So if I draw that in, does everybody notice that's a horizontal line? Vertical or horizontal lines, you don't have to do the distance formula. I mean, you still can and get the same answer. You're just going to do more work. Horizontal and vertical lines, let's just count the spaces. Okay, so if I'm going to count the spaces in between, then we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I know from the museum to the hospital has a distance of 8. Now my total would therefore be adding the two distances together. So I would take 4.3 plus 8. So then my final distance would give me 12.3. Okay, example number 3. We have a picture to look at. And on the part A, it says find the distance of AD. So if I look at side AD, I'll outline it here in green. That's a vertical line. If it's a vertical line, then we get to count spaces. We don't have to do the formula. So I'm just going to start at A, count my spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the distance for part A is 7. Done. Now we're going to go to slope, something we've talked about before. We just want to make sure you can remember it. So the slope of the line DC. So for slope, I'm going to pick 2 points on the line. So they got to be nice, neat points. So I'm going to choose the y-intercept. So I'll make a dot here in purple. And then I'm going to choose point C. So I'll make another dot in purple. So remember, slope, we need to draw a right triangle between the 2 points to count rise over run. So I'm going to draw in my little bitty triangle here from point to point. So I'm going down 1, so that's -1. And I'm going across 1, 2, 3, 4. So remember, slope is rise over run. So my slope would be -1/4. Okay, part C, I want to find the distance of AB. AB is not a horizontal or vertical line. Darn. So that means we have to do the distance formula. So what is the ordered pair for A? Well, that would be -4, 0. And what is the ordered pair for B? Well, that would be 4, -2. So now let's plug in the distance formula. So subtract your x's. So 4 minus -4 squared plus a quantity squared. Don't forget that, sorry. And then y, subtract your y's. So -2 minus 0 quantity squared. Hey, minus and negative switches to plus. 4 plus 4 is 8 squared. Plus -2 minus 0 is -2 squared. So 8 squared is 64. Plus -2 squared is 4. 64 plus 4 is 68. And the square root of 68 rounds to 8.2. And the last one. Find the slope of AD. So line AD. Well, this isn't a diagonal line. So if it's not a diagonal line for slope, we don't have to count rise over run. We just have to remember our sayings for vertical and horizontal lines. And that was hoi, vox. And we have a vertical line. So that means I'm looking at the vux part. VUX, and U stands for the slope, and U stands for undefined slope. And we're finished.